So news recently came out that AMD is not going to be supporting the 300 or 400 series of motherboards with the Ryzen 4000 series. That means that if you have an X370, a B350, an A320, a B450, or an X470 motherboard, if you're looking to upgrade to Ryzen 4000 series once that eventually launches, you're going to have to jump up to the 500 series of motherboards, B550 or X570. So let's talk about that. Now, of course, if you read the title and looked at the thumbnail, I am not a fan of this move. Just get this sort of out of the way right away. AMD is not the good guys. At least this time around. Now, one of the rationales being given is just that it's hard to support an ever-growing list of CPUs on a BIOS chip, especially with the actual storage available on the BIOS chip. There's a finite amount of CPUs you can actually pack support for into one of these BIOS chips, and that is a completely fair and rational argument. The problem with that argument is it just doesn't hold water once you actually start looking at what you can do with a BIOS. And this is something we actually saw from some 300 level motherboards where as the newer Ryzen chips were launching, they were actually dropping some of the older support for the original APUs on the AM4 platform. Those were still featuring the older architectures, not the new actual Zen architectures. So those APUs were just taking up space on BIOS chips. Most people weren't actually using those sort of A10 and A8 processors that were briefly available there on the AM4 platform. So motherboard manufacturers, as a way to clear out some space to support newer CPUs, were actually dropping some of the older support for those CPUs that basically no one was really using. So even if motherboard manufacturers and AMD is sort of eyeing this sort of storage issue with the BIOS chips itself, you can get around that by dropping support for older CPUs. Offer different BIOS that maybe have a common CPU or a common generation that they're all gonna support. So for example, the 400 level motherboards, the B450 and X470 motherboards, maybe for them, they drop Zen support, maintain the 2000 series of CPUs, the Zen Plus support, and then Zen 2 and Zen 3 support if they're running low on storage for those BIOS chips. Maybe just drop the support for original Zen. And for that matter, there's no reason that AMD can't sort of pick out certain CPUs that were very popular to carry forward while dropping a lot of the older ones. For example, a Ryzen 1400 or a 1500X, while those were nice chips when they launched, they didn't really get all that popular, and that's partially because the Ryzen 1600 was so popular. And right now, for example, the Ryzen 1600 AF is an extremely popular part on the 12 nanometer process. So maybe the 1600 AF, even though it's numbered like a Zen part, even though it's really a Zen Plus part, maybe they carry that forward in support and then drop most of the 1000 series. Or AMD could take a hands-off approach and let motherboard manufacturers sort of pick their own path, and maybe those manufacturers offer multiple different BIOS that say, you know, if you have a Ryzen 1700, you need to stick with this BIOS as the most up-to-date BIOS that would still support that CPU, but if it drops support, then maybe there's a form that gets filled out on the website or the support website and says, okay, you have a Ryzen 2600, so you can update to this BIOS. Or if it says, you know, maybe you're planning on upgrading to a Ryzen 4600 when that eventually launches, you need to get this BIOS because it supports the CPU you currently have, but also the CPU you want to have. Now, one of the arguments that I've seen sort of thrown out there as to why AMD is still not the bad guy in this situation is that Intel has been a much worse offender in regard to constantly forcing users to get new motherboards to support the next generation of CPU, even though it's on virtually the exact same process. I mean, we've been on 14 nanometer with Intel since Skylake. So I do understand why you might want to point that out, that Intel has been a much worse offender, because objectively they have. The problem is the lack of transparency to me, because even though AMD did promise longer support for AM4, they haven't really kept everyone in the loop as to what to expect moving forward. One of the big problems with the Ryzen 3000 launch is that we were given these X570 boards, which were quite expensive, but if you're pairing a Ryzen 3600 with a motherboard, you don't need the power delivery or if you're not using extremely fast storage, you don't need PCIe Gen 4. So maybe you decided to fall back on an X470 or a B450 motherboard to save some money at the time. Now the problem is that you didn't realize at the time you were forcing a motherboard upgrade down the road, because maybe you're planning on upgrading from that 3600 to something like a 4600, and now you're stuck with this B450 X470 motherboard that at the time you thought would be compatible moving forward, and now it's just not. And the timing of all this is really peculiar because DDR5 is not that far away at this point, and I was kind of starting to think that AMD was just going to carry AM4 and let people continue to upgrade CPUs through this entire end of the DDR4 sort of memory cycle, and then when DDR5 hit the mainstream market, I felt like that was the obvious place to sort of make that hard transition where people were going to have to upgrade a motherboard anyways. Well, now if you're upgrading, you have to get a new motherboard to support Ryzen 4000, but then you're going to have to get another new motherboard whenever AMD adopts DDR5 on the mainstream platform. So it's just not really, to me, the right time to force this upgrade. If anything, it's the right time to sort of have a breakdown from AMD and just say, motherboard manufacturers, support whatever you would like to support, and we're going to let the market sort of set that trend. Or of course, best case scenario would be AMD just says, you know what, we're going to let 400 series motherboards carry forward and support the 4000 series of processors, but it does look like AMD might be digging its heels in just a little bit here, which is not great to see. It's actually kind of a bummer to see, but if that's what AMD wants to do and that's what they're going to follow through with, then ultimately the best thing that consumers can do right now is just put pressure and continuous pressure on AMD, pointing out that this is just not a good move for the average consumer, because frankly, as it stands right now, most people don't take advantage of PCIe Gen 4, and it's great that the new motherboards have that available to the end user if that's what you feel like you need, but the vast majority of people won't see any tangible benefit from that. And right now, B550 motherboards are going to be more expensive than B450 motherboards are right now. So if you want to get onto something like a 3600 and you're trying to do it as inexpensively as possible, keeping in mind an upgrade path, you actually might want to go B550 now, since you know that the B450 motherboards, while they're great for something like a Ryzen 3600 right now, they're not going to be able to give you much of an upgrade path into the future with Ryzen 4000. So this is where, of course, I kick it back to all of you guys. What do you think about this? I personally think it's not a good look. It's not a good move for AMD. It's not a good look for AMD. They are the villain in this circumstance, in my humble opinion. Let me know what you think in those comments down below. And of course, if you like the video and you want to see more like it, give it a like, share, subscribe, comment, all those things. You know, you can always hit dislike if you decide that you don't like me piling on AMD in this instance, but that's your decision. You can follow me on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware, and as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.